the enemy to our Constitution is the progressive movement. Stop arguing about Republicans and Democrats. It's the progressive movement.
Where in the Constitution does it say the word czar or anything like it? It doesn't.
I think it's time we ask ourselves if we still know the freedoms that were intended for us by the Founding Fathers. If we lose freedom here, there's no place to escape to. This is the last stand on earth.
Hello, America, and welcome to another special edition of the Glenn Beck program. Tonight, an hour dedicated to the Constitution. Yeah, on television. I know. Crazy. 4 pages. That's all it took. 4 pages. And in those 4 pages, our founders were able to map out the idea for a country that would ultimately become the most prosperous nation in the history of the planet. The Constitution's goal was to limit the power of government so the power would lie with you, the people. Today, the government has abandoned that whole crazy idea and kept the power for itself and keeps gathering more. So what's to blame for that? Well, no surprise coming from me. Enemy number one is progressivism. Tonight, I've got 2 of the Constitution's staunchest defenders to help me out. Author and historian David Barton, founder of Wall Builders, and the one and only good friend of the program, Judge Andrew Napolitano, host of Freedom Watch on the Fox Business Network. So let's begin at the beginning. How was the Constitution born? Our founders started the country after we won the Revolutionary War, and they started our country not with the Constitution, but with something called the Articles of Confederation. It set up such a limited government that the whole thing flew apart. You couldn't even do business across state lines. Our country was a total mess. Do you know who the first president of the country was? This guy. John Hanson. No, it wasn't George Washington. John Hanson. But see, I said our country. It's a different country. Under the Articles of Confederation, they first put it right here. It was too close to anarchy. It didn't work. It fell apart. Every state was fighting against each other, cheating against each other. It was too close to anarchy. So in 1785, Congress knew that it wasn't working. And unbeknownst to them, James Madison and Thomas Jefferson had been exchanging letters, and they were trying to work on a totally new system of government. They knew that they were never going to get something this radical past any members of Congress, any of the states, because nobody trusted anybody anymore. But they had this thing called a republic. It moved this government a little farther down, moved it to about here. But they needed somebody to help bring everybody together. They needed somebody that they could trust, that everyone in the room would trust. They needed someone who they knew would bring everybody together, everybody would trust, and in the end, would do the right thing, even at his own expense.
George Washington got a bunch of them together and said, we really need to look at redoing the Articles of Confederation, which led to the Constitutional Convention in 1787, where they did get together and they said, let's redo the Articles of Confederation. They looked at that and said, let's just scrap it and start again. And that's where we come up with the Constitution. When you look at the founders' idea for the nation, it was that the people would be in charge through a representative federal government. And out of the forms of government, the Founding Fathers went through and said democracy is worse than anything. It's worse than anarchy. Democracy is worse than a monarchy, and we know what they thought about monarchies. I mean, democracy was on the bottom of the rung because it allowed human motions to get through. People make decisions when they're angry or when they're happy or when they don't have all the facts. So in a representative Republican form of government, everything slows down. And we complain about the pace of government, but that's really good because now you have to debate, you have to get 2 sides in there, you have to look at all the aspects, you have hearings on it to get all the information. It's a slow process, but it keeps the feelings and emotions out. But they wanted the people to have the power. The Constitution forbids America from becoming a democracy, and a federal government means that we share powers in a vertical direction. Thomas Jefferson, in his first inaugural address, he went through his president and said, the purpose of federal government is 5-fold. And in his inaugural address, he listed the 5 things that the government was supposed to do. He said, number 1 is to acknowledge and adore God. And it's interesting, Jefferson said that, but they all believe that if you don't start with the knowledge of God, you don't understand inalienable rights. Second thing is for government to exercise frugality. Frugality in spending and power and authority. Be a frugal government. He said third is to restrain the infliction of injury. Government exists to keep bad guys under control. It's not to regulate the good guys, it's to keep the bad guys from hurting somebody. He said the fourth thing government's supposed to do is to encourage entrepreneurship and free enterprise. Is to be business friendly and encourage, because that's where prosperity comes from, that's where jobs come from. He said the fifth thing government's to do is to protect property and the earnings of citizens. They considered the money you earned as your property, and they couldn't take your money away from you any more than they could take your house or your property or anything else away. And he said that's the fivefold purpose of government. Government exists for those 5 reasons. We've shifted so much away from what they envisioned, which was a small, limited government with 5 primary responsibilities, where that we, the people, were in charge of all 3 branches. That's what they wanted for America. And if we read and study the Constitution and get back to that plan, that's what's caused America to be the most prosperous, stable nation in the history of the world.
So why have we shifted so far away from what our founding fathers envisioned? Progressivism, that was it. But what exactly is progressivism? Give me a definition of what a progressive really is.
Well, Glenn, to me, progressivism is all about moving beyond the Constitution, getting beyond the bedrock principles of the American founding. The progressives detested the political ideas behind the Declaration of Independence because they enshrined the idea of individual God-given rights as the end of government. They detested the Constitution because the Constitution put limits on the national government, which were designed to uphold those rights.
Because that doesn't mean that the Constitution is still alive in our minds and hearts. Mm-hmm. What it means is the Constitution means anything the judges on the Supreme Court want it to mean, which absolutely undermines the whole idea of popular sovereignty and free government. The reason the original intent of the Constitution is critically important is because the people have spoken.
Progressives really are the bane of the Constitution's existence. They view the Constitution as a living, breathing document that evolves. Well, okay, sounds like an interesting idea, but is that what our founders had in mind?
You know, a lot of folks today, progressives and social evolutionists, look at it and say, oh, the Constitution is flawed. It didn't take so many things into consideration. It needs to reflect a living document, living, breathing, we the people. I mean, who cares what they wanted 200 years ago? It's got to be a living, breathing document that reflects what we the people want. You know, they've just made the Founding Fathers' point. That's what the Constitution is a living, breathing document. But the point that's different from the Founding Fathers and progressives is who's in charge of the evolution of the Constitution. The Constitution itself says, now, we know that things will change and times will change and people want different things. That's why we're giving you Article 5 of the Constitution that allows the people to evolve the Constitution. You have to have 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate agree to an amendment, and 3/4 of the state have to ratify it. So any change that's made in the Constitution, we the people made it. We're the ones that wanted it. We're the ones that ratified it. We the people said, you know, there's no term limits on presidents in the Constitution, but we want term limits on presidents. The Constitution did not abolish slavery, but we did in the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment. See, we've evolved the Constitution 27 times, and it's always because we, the people, wanted to make a change. The problem with progressive is they want themselves to evolve the Constitution, tell the people what their values should be. Most of the things that the people that are progressives want the courts to do are totally out of line with the people. There's amendments that have come through that haven't necessarily been the best for the country, and the 17th and the 16th Amendment are 2 of those. Matter of fact, there's a great little poster out that says, 1913, the worst year ever. And you look at it and you go, well, that's when we got the 16th Amendment with the progressive income tax authorization. That's when we got the 17th Amendment, which abolished the election of senators by the states. That's when we got Woodrow Wilson inaugurated president.
How many people, before we called you to say, hey, you want to come to the show, how many people here could say, oh yeah, the 17th Amendment, I know what that is? 2, 3. Okay, you guys don't count because you're doing a constitutional thing. Nobody. How many really know what it is now, the 17th Amendment? Okay? This is amazing. Like all bad things, it started in 1913. Woodrow Wilson, yet again. He supported this. Immediately now, when I see Woodrow Wilson, I immediately know, bad thing. You can be quite certain that something is not going to have a good outcome if Woodrow Wilson was involved. Before 1913, U.S. senators were appointed by the state legislature. Madison said that the House of Representatives would always be a national institution because the people would be directly elected by the people. But the Senate, he said, will derive its powers from the states. Here's the idea. You have the senators be representatives of the state interest, kind of like a lobbyist for the state. You'd think progressives would like that. The 17th Amendment changed that and instituted a direct popular election of United States senators. 2 senators, right there, 2 Senate, or the United States Senate shall be comprised of 2 senators from each state elected by the people. Okay? Why did they do this? Well, they wanted to take the direct representation out. They wanted to make sure that the states didn't have the direct representation. Let me give you an example of the 17th Amendment coming into play right now, today. Obama's health care bill would have never seen the light of day. A lot of the things that they do in Washington would have never seen the light of day. Why? Because it wouldn't be in the interest of your state.
We know that Wilson was one of the worst offenders of the Constitution in the 20th century, but he's had some company. Judge Andrew Napolitano has his thoughts.
The 20th century is a disaster for the Constitution, in large measure because of the way it began with Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, the way it moved up to FDR. The 3 of them together demonstrating publicly and privately utter contempt for the natural law, the concept that individuals have natural rights that the government can't interfere with, and the concept that the Constitution was written to keep the government off the people's backs. Teddy Roosevelt, his cousin Franklin Roosevelt, and their mentor Woodrow Wilson basically ushered in periods of government in which the government took the position that it could write any law, regulate any behavior, tax any event, and seek any goal, whether authorized or permitted by the Constitution or not. Wilson brought an era to the federal government in which the federal government would have a personal relationship with individuals, nowhere authorized in the Constitution, and would basically tell them how to live, what water they could drink, what food they could consume, even what words they could utter during wartime. Wilson's Justice Department actually prosecuted a man in New Jersey for playing Beethoven's music in public, and another man in Ohio for reading the Constitution, particularly the Bill of Rights, on a public street corner, fearing that that would cause people to criticize the government. FDR ushered in an era of central economic planning, much along the lines of his colleague at the time running the Soviet Union, whom he referred to as Uncle Joe, of course, one of the most murderous thugs in history, Joe Stalin. FDR admired Joe Stalin. FDR admired Benito Mussolini, who was the fascist dictator of Italy at the time. And the 2 of them, Stalin and Mussolini, had a tremendous amount of government control over the economy, which FDR envied. He understood very little about economics himself, but he had a lot of big government folks who did around him, persuaded him that there would be more prosperity and more equality in the country if the economy could be centrally planned from Washington, D.C. This attitude defies the Constitution because there's no authority in the Constitution for the Congress to take money from one person and give to another. We are suffering from the big government seeds that they planted. We are suffering from them today.
I'd also like to point out here that not all progressive presidents of the 20th century were Democrats. As you know, Teddy Roosevelt was a Republican. Teddy Roosevelt was the beginning of the Progressive Party. He started it. Who else? Herbert Hoover. And the Hoover family always gets angry at me when I say this, but Hoover was a self-described progressive who believed in regulation and actually started the first New Deal.
Herbert Hoover has this historic reputation as a champion of the free market whose ways had to be corrected by FDR. He was a progressive in the Woodrow Wilson, Theodore Roosevelt vein. He attempted the central planning of the economy, which was picked up by FDR. It was he who imposed, or the Republicans under him, ruinous tariffs, which made it impossible to import goods at reasonable fair market values, which caused retaliation from other countries, which made it impossible to export goods at a fair market value. I don't know how this happened, but one of my goals is to correct this historical misreading of Herbert Hoover. He was as bad as Theodore Roosevelt, and he laid the groundwork for Franklin Roosevelt, and he was a Republican in name only.
So, what constitutes an offender of the Constitution? And what does it take to become a defender?
Someone who's a defender of the Constitution is one who understands the complete philosophy of the Constitution. And to be a defender of the Constitution doesn't mean you just want limited government. It also means you want to protect individual rights just as much as you want to limit government. So you have Ronald Reagan, who, and today we would call him both a social and an economic conservative. In other words, he wants the deregulation out, he wants the federal government smaller, he wants them doing less, he wants businesses being encouraged, he wants the prosperity that comes from free enterprise. That's all good. He wants less regulation, he wants less intrusion. But on the other side, he understood the inalienable rights. You look at someone like Eisenhower. Eisenhower, I mean, he desegregated Washington, D.C., but he understood the Southern mentality of the kind of racism that's there. But he went in and took the federal government and made sure that the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment were going to be upheld in Arkansas and in Tennessee and in Texas after the desegregation case in 1954, where the Supreme Court actually got the right decision through a wrong logic, but they upheld the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. Here you got Eisenhower saying, I don't care what my personal views are. This is a constitutional issue, and I'm going to do it the constitutional means. So people can criticize him for taking in the National Guard and federalizing it, but he was still upholding the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments. And that's really how you have to judge between a defender and an offender of the Constitution, is whether they used constitutional means to try to solve the problems, or whether they got these brilliant ideas and went around the Constitution to try to solve problems. And that nearly always characterizes the difference between the good guys and the bad guys on constitutional issues.
Amongst those of us who have studied the Constitution for a living, you could find violations of it, significant violations of it, in virtually every single presidency, starting with George Washington and up to President Obama. The strongest defenders of the Constitution, from those of us who study it for a living, typically are only two, Thomas Jefferson and Grover Cleveland. Jefferson, of course, plainly argued that many of the things that the Federalists had done, like the Alien and Sedition Acts, he simply would have nothing to do with. Grover Cleveland, on the other hand, vetoed many, many pieces of legislation. More vetoes because of the absence of authority for the legislative act in the Constitution than any other president in American history. An unsung hero for constitutional law.
Next, some popular myths about the Constitution.
When we look at where we are today as citizens, the condition of the country is always a reflection of we the people and what we ourselves know about the Constitution. There are so many things that are out there, constitutional myths. We the people, by and large, do not know our Constitution very well. It's worth reading every single year. It takes about 20 minutes to do it. That's what will turn the country around, is we the people knowing that document and using that document.
Welcome back to the program, where we're spending an hour talking about the Constitution. Was the Constitution a pro-slavery document? How about the truth about the 3/5 clause?
Frederick Douglass actually was very upset at our founders because he said, I'm not just 3/5 of a human being, I'm a full human being. This is an argument that is used even today that Frederick Douglass corrected.
Yes.
Tell me the story.
What happened was after he escaped in 1838, he ended up in New York. In New York, he gets discipled by a lot of anti-slavery folks, and that's the Lysander Spooners and Gerrit Smith and William Lloyd Garrison, etc. And Massachusetts society hears him do his testimony, and they said, oh man, you got to speak for us. Well, in the meantime, they're saying, you know, you need to overthrow the Constitution because the Constitution is a slavery document. The founders gave us slavery in the document, and there's all these clauses of slavery. And he believed that. But bless his heart, when the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society said, we want to pay you to go on the road full time, he said, okay, I got to make sure I know this stuff. So he sat down and read the Constitution for himself, not just what the guys had taught him. He read it himself, and he read the documents surrounding it, the debates going around it. And he comes out with this epiphany and says, this is a great anti-slavery document. And he says, every clause in it. You go, whoa, time out. How can the 3/5 clause be an anti-slavery clause? Real easy. He read the convention notes. What happened was you had all these anti-slavery founding fathers. You had, for example, James Wilson. You had Elbridge Sherry. You had Luther Martin.
Ben Franklin.
All these guys, all these anti-slavery guys. And you had 3 hardcore southern states that were pro-slavery. There's Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina. And so the Constitution says every 30,000 inhabitants you have, you get a representative to the House of Representatives. And in South Carolina and Georgia, there's more blacks than there are whites, and they're slaves. And they said, great, every 30,000 slaves we've got, we'll get another member of Congress. Guys up north said, no, 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 we're not doing that. If you want to count them, you free them. Every free person you have, you can get 30,000, you can have, and they said, no, no, we're going to count this, or we're not going to be part of these United States. So this debate goes back and forth, and what's really funny is the guys in the South said, you know, blacks are property. I love
they're not people.
They're not
people, but they want to count them as people.
And see, the guys in the North said, no, every black is equal to a white. We're all created equal. You get 30,000 free blacks, you get a member of Congress. And that was the incentive to free blacks. It was, you get to count them for Congress. So the guys up north started having fun with the guys down south. They said, you know, you guys say that blacks are property. And Elbridge Gerry did this, and Luther Martin did it out of Maryland. They said, okay, here's what we're going to do up north. Is you're counting 30,000 pieces of property to get a member of Congress. We're going to count 30,000 chairs and horses and cows. We'll count our property. Every 30,000 pieces of property we get an anti-slavery member to Congress. So they went back and forth on this thing, and what they finally ended up was the 3/5 clause that says, okay, we will count 3/5 of the slave population, not individuals, which meant you now had to have 50,000 before you could get a pro-slavery rep to Congress. The 3/5 clause cut the slavery representation in Congress in half. And when Frederick Douglass read that, he said, the 3/5 clause, that has nothing to do with the worth. That has to do with the representation. It makes it harder to get a pro-slavery representative in Congress. The Constitution's an anti-slavery document. And it was.
Another myth to set straight is regarding who fathered the Constitution.
Today, we like to say Madison's the father of the Constitution, but that really is not an accurate statement. Now, Madison had an influence, no question about it, and he's really the scribe of the convention. He wrote everything down. But Madison very wisely made a statement back as an older man. People were looking at him and said, man, you must have had a remarkable influence in the Constitution. He said, no. He said, you can't look at this document as being the result of one head or one mind. This was the result of many heads and many minds. You've also got folks like Roger Sherman who came up with the whole bicameral concept where we have a House and a Senate. One represents the states, one represents the people. That dual and that was a big deal for them because they said, you know, electing a president, this is not a good deal because we have 13 colonies, but there's enough people in Massachusetts and there's enough people in New York and Pennsylvania. Those 3 states can get together and elect the president, and the other 10 colonies, we got nothing to say over it. So they didn't like this thing of just the population doing it, but they didn't like the thing of just the states doing it because they wanted the people to have a voice. So Roger Sherman comes up with the bicameral concept, and by the way, that's the basis of the electoral college system, which is such a cool system. People don't understand it today, But the president, if he only had to be elected by the people, he would never leave the East Coast or the West Coast. He'd start up at Seattle and go down to Portland. He'd go down to the Oakland area in San Francisco and go down to LA and San Diego. And he'd pop over to Miami and come up and hit all the big cities, and that's more than 50% of the population. He would never visit the inland part of America. But because of the Electoral College says, wait a minute, states get a voice too, now the president has to go to Iowa, and he has to go to New Hampshire, and he has to go to Nevada, and all these other places to get votes that he would never have to get. So that's Roger Sherman. That's a really cool part. You also have James Wilson, who's called a master builder of the Constitution. He was actually the second most active member at the Constitutional Convention. Spoke at the floor of the convention 168 times. He was an original justice on the Supreme Court once we ratified the Constitution. He's a big voice. Charles Pinckney out of South Carolina. He had more winning proposals than any other member of the Constitutional Convention, but nobody ever hears of Charles Pinckney. And you really have to look at the Constitution as a result of all of them.
Next, to understand the Constitution, you have to go back to the Declaration of Independence.
The Constitution is really born out of the Declaration of Independence. You have no clue of understanding the Constitution if you don't have a good grasp on the Declaration. 85 words right up top that give you 5 fundamental principles of American government. Those five thoughts are real simple. The first one says, hey, we believe there's a creator. We in government believe that. Number 2, we believe that the creator gives certain specific guaranteed and alienable rights to man. And number 3, we believe that government exists to protect those specific rights. They say now below that there is a moral law. They call it the laws of nature. Nature's God. 8 words out of the Declaration that came from a law book of the day. That's the 4th point. And then they say below that moral law we have the consent of the governed. So those 5 specific things, you take those 5 points and move them over to the Constitution, and now you start understanding the Constitution.
Welcome back to our hour-long special on the Constitution. This past summer, lawmakers went back to the Declaration of Independence when questioning then Supreme Court nominee Elena Kagan. They evoked the Declaration to get her views on the Second Amendment to the Constitution. Listen to her answers.
Senator Coburn, to be honest with you, I don't have a view of what are natural rights independent of the Constitution. And my job as a justice will be to enforce and defend the Constitution and other laws of the United States.
So you wouldn't embrace what the Declaration of Independence says, that we have certain God-given inalienable rights that aren't given in the Constitution, that they're ours alone, and that the government doesn't give those to us?
Senator Coburn, I believe that the Constitution is an extraordinary document, and I'm not saying I do not believe that there are rights pre-existing the Constitution and the laws, but my job as a justice is to enforce the Constitution and the laws.
Well, I understand that. Well, I'm not talking about as a justice. I'm talking about Elena Kagan. What do you believe? Are there inalienable rights for us? Do you believe that?
Senator Coburn, I think that the question of what I believe as to what people's rights are outside the Constitution and the laws, that you should not want me to act in any way on the basis of such a belief. I
would want you to always act on the basis of a belief of what our Declaration of Independence says.
Now let's watch as our own president is now omitting words from the Declaration. The president has given a speech where he's used a quote from the Declaration of Independence. He has omitted, I believe, the most vital part of the quote, and nobody understands why. This is not a small deal, and I want to explain. First, let me show you what he said the first time on September 15th. Here he is.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal,
endowed by their Creator, and
endowed with certain inalienable rights, life and liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Okay, the glaring omission there is the one word, Creator. Okay, after we, and I'm sure others, brought it up, the White House insisted the comment was made on the fly. It was inadvertent. It wasn't in a teleprompter. Okay. The White House Deputy Press Secretary Josh Ernst talked about the incident, and he said that, quote, the president is in full agreement with the Declaration of Independence. Any suggestion to the contrary is just silly. Well, it's not. Woodrow Wilson said the Declaration of Independence was meaningless. So why is it silly now that this president, especially when he leaves out a very important word? It has nothing to do with religion, by the way. I want you to know that. We gave him the benefit of the doubt, except 7 days later, the president again, while speaking at a Democratic fundraiser, omitted the one word creator when referencing the exact same passage from the Declaration. The omission was part of a prepared transcript. Now, they didn't have any cameras at this dinner, so we had to go to the White House and get the transcript. Here is the White House transcript on what the president said. Quote, "If we believe that all people are created equal and everyone is endowed with certain inalienable rights, then we are going to make sure those words live." But he goes on, but it's pretty clear that this isn't being done on the fly. Or else there's a speechwriter at the White House that needs to be selling vacuum cleaners door to door. I'm just saying. This is not some sort of oversight. And here's why I feel compelled to talk to you about this tonight. The mail I get from people who are even on the right who say, "Oh, just shut up about your religion, blah, blah." It's not religion. You must understand why every word was put in the Declaration. It is a very big deal. It is one of our critical founding principles that we do not get our rights from man. We get them from God. Why is that important? In the Declaration, they were very careful to make sure it wasn't Christian God or Jesus or Moses or anybody else. It was nature's God and nature's law. Why? Because they wanted to make it as broad as they could, but make sure that everyone understood it is from above that rights are endowed and they are unalienable, meaning they cannot be changed, they cannot be taken away. If God or the Creator is taken away, where do you get your rights from? If our rights come from other men, then men can take them back. This is about as fundamental of understanding of our liberty. It is essential. It is the reason I made such a big issue out of what Senator Tom Harkin said during the health care debate. Do you remember what he said? I think it was on Christmas Eve or something like that.
What this bill does is we finally take that step. As our leader said earlier, we take that step from health care as a privilege to health care as an inalienable right of every single American citizen.
Okay. Stop.
And as I said
stop.
this bill does not...
Okay, look, Congress doesn't pass rights. They cannot pass rights. They cannot create a right. They pass laws. But this is an idea, a notion that permeates our government now. The rights our founders enumerated, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, have become instead the right to health care, right to a job, the right to a certain wage they deem decent, and the only way to provide those rights is to take your rights to the things you've earned. The problem is, these new rights were the rights outlined by Karl Marx and Engels, not our founding fathers. If that is the path we're going to take as Americans now, then let's have that discussion. Let's stop pretending that we're working from the same fundamental principles, because we are not. If the president, who is a constitutional scholar, if the president doesn't understand the critical word creator in the Declaration of Independence, we're not on the same page. And it has nothing to do with faith or God or anything else. It has everything to do with man seizing power. If you don't believe that we're endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, which means you cannot ever change them, you cannot take them, don't pretend that you just forgot those three crucial words. Come out and tell the American people that you do not buy into the concept of rights coming from creators. Defend your true position. That's all I've been asking for, is you to do your own homework. Question me. Look all of this up. Look it all up, please, I beg you. It does nothing if you're just repeating what I say. Look it up yourself. Know it to be true. And then go to the battlefield of ideas and argue it out and fight it out on the battlefield of ideas. Let the people decide. Under those conditions, not in the cover of darkness or not with lies or smears, our chances are very good of winning, because I trust the American people, and so did our founders. Progressives don't. Back in a minute. It's one of our biggest threats to our Constitution today. It's called transnationalism, and it means that our Constitution is second to international law. One of the world's leading advocates of transnationalism is Harold Koh, a guy appointed by President Obama to advise our State Department. This is the definition of transnationalism. Transnationalists believe that U.S. courts can and should use their interpretive powers to promote the development of the global legal system, while the nationalists tend to claim that U.S. courts should limit their attention to the development of a national system. Ed, explain how this works. I mean, all the way from, well, let's start with death penalty. Can't have death penalty with a transnationalist, right?
Well, those are Harold Koh's own words that you quoted, and it's even worse than he indicates. What transnationalists like Koh aim to do is use the various mechanisms of so-called international law to override our constitutional system of representative government. Harold Koh has said that based on what's going on abroad, the death penalty ought to be deemed unconstitutional, even though the Constitution plainly presupposes the permissibility of the death penalty.
Hold on just a second. Hang on just a second. Edward, this is not... So I think so Americans can understand it. You know, correct me if I'm wrong, Ed, but I think this is the way it works. That if you know how people can't get they can't get you to vote on something. For instance, let's use Proposition 8. Proposition 8. The Californians have voted twice on this, but each time they bring it to the court and kick it up to the court. Well, if they lose in the court and then there's nothing else higher, what transnationalists do is they kick it up one level and it becomes an international issue. And then we just tie into these treaties, so then it doesn't matter what you vote, what the courts say, what Congress says, what the president says. It's an international law, right?
That's right. The ultimate goal is to have a system of rulers who are this elite of transnational lawyers who are completely unaccountable to American citizens.
There are a lot of people, some of whom are now in the Obama administration, who believe that the United States should move into a process of international norming where we conform our domestic laws to the international consensus, whether it's on death penalty or climate change or gun control or a whole range of issues. For almost every domestic issue, there's a kind of international counterpart. I think this is fundamentally dangerous because I think ultimately it takes decision-making away from the people in our constitutional system and puts it into the international arena.
All right. Now, so people understand what this means, because I think people are like, oh, well, you know what, whatever the UN, and when it gets out of control, we'll just unpeg from that. And I don't, personally, I think there are a couple shows going on. There's the shows that, we all vote and we all go out and we do that thing, and then we're like, wait a minute, these guys aren't meaning what they say, and we think they have the power. But every time somebody tries to pass a law and they don't like the results, then they kick it to the courts. And if the courts don't go their way, then they kick it up to the international law. And you don't just get out of the international law. And that seems to be building some sort of framework that says, oh, you cute little Americans, that's great, you can have your Constitution, but oh, I'm sorry, that part, that disagrees with international law. That becomes fascistic on a global scale where we answer to them, but they don't answer to us.
Well, here's the basic question, and it really is very interesting to see what politicians say compared to what some of the supporters of these plans do out in the political environment. Do you think that international law is superior to the Constitution or not? This is not an either. It's not a thing where you can say, well, I think they're sort of tied. Either our Constitution is the supreme law on this world, or international law is. I personally think there is no authority on earth superior to the Constitution. That's not what many of these people think.
Oh, well, I have to tell you. I mean, if Great Britain wants to say, hey, we're superior, whatever, I mean, they can say whatever they want. But on our land, we are. On our land, the United States Constitution is supreme, period. It's ours.
Absolutely. And I don't have any trouble with the world where there are 192 member governments in the UN, each of which says, for our purposes, on our territory, our Constitution or our form of government is supreme. The issue is those people, many in Europe, some in the United States, who say above our Constitution there are international norms, international customary law that trump the Constitution.
Next, how we the people can reverse the damage.
Where where specifically does the Constitution grant Congress the authority to enact an individual health insurance mandate?
Are you serious? Are you serious? I don't.
Where in the Constitution is the federal government charged with maintaining people's health?
Well, there's not in the Constitution. There's nothing in the Constitution that says the federal government has got anything to do with most of the stuff that we do.
Where in the Constitution?
We are going to. I don't worry about the Constitution on this, to be honest.
Is your question they can do? Is your answer that they can do anything?
The federal government, yes, can do most anything in this country.
We're talking about the Constitution for an hour tonight, and I hope you've TiVo'd this show or any of the specials that we're doing. But we want to focus here for a few minutes on reversing the damage.
We are close to the exact opposite of what the framers wanted. They wanted a small national government with choice among the states. We have a national government that regulates virtually every aspect of our lives today.
So how do we reverse it?
We shrink the government back into the confines of the Constitution. We abolish the income tax, remove the lifeblood of the federal government's excess, which is cash, remove its ability to tap our pockets whenever it wants, however it wants. At some point, taxation is theft, and the government must understand that.
But you can say that, and I think we're on the same page. You get it because of this book. You can't make that case to the American. Everybody will answer the same. Well, you're never going to do that. You're never.
The American people have it within their power to abolish the IRS and to restructure the government.
With one thing.
Education.
The truth.
Correct.
The truth.
Correct.
You have to correct the lie. Once you correct the lie, everything changes.
There's an old one-liner that a nation of sheep breeds a government of wolves. And it's true. When we pliantly accept violations of our natural rights, we embolden the government to violate them even more. The more sheep-like the people are, the more wolf-like the government becomes. When I saw the way people last month around Thanksgiving pliantly accepted regulations imposed upon them by a bureaucracy called the TSA, which basically said, we're going to take a picture of you that looks like pornography and we're going to keep it, or we're going to touch you in ways so offensive that it could arguably constitute a sexual assault. When I saw people accept that in the name of safety, I thought to myself, government propaganda works. I thought to myself, we are becoming a nation of sheep because we are believing the government nonsense that this will keep us safe. When you believe the government that it can keep you safe by invading your natural rights, you'll end up with neither, not liberty or safety. Who will keep us safe from the government?
Did you ever stop to think why "We the People" was written in such big letters at the top of the Constitution? I believe it was some sort of code. Back in a minute. What is the code in the Constitution? It's easy. Do you think that was a font problem that somebody said, hey, scale it down, we the people, it's too big, it's not all going to fit on a page? No, that was code. They knew that it had to send a message. They knew people would get lost. They wouldn't know the answer. They'd get detached from the Constitution. Jefferson and Adams talked about it in their letters back and forth. So what did they do? They wanted to make a point. Hey, dummy, look, we the people is the answer.
I love the way that James Wilson said this. James Wilson, one of the guys who wrote the Constitution, he says here in America, he says the people are the masters of government. He says in Europe, the government is masters of the people. And that's the big deal. We the people was always to remind our elected officials and ourselves that, hey, government's here to serve us. We're not here to serve government.
The real power to change America's course still resides with you. You are the protector of liberty. You are the guardian of freedom. It's not on the people in Washington. Damn it. This is your country. This is my country. They don't surround us. We surround them.
special thanks, as always, to David Barton. His DVD set, The American Heritage Series, is unbelievable, and it is available at wallbuilders.com. Also, special thanks to Judge Andrew Napolitano. You can watch him on Freedom Watch on the Fox Business Network. From New York, good night, America.
America's getting bigger, its people are getting warmer, and their politics